And at the question period, they had a former soldier who also became the president of the Israel Awareness Club later on. His name is Noam Gilead. And he started talking for like a very, very long time. And everybody was getting irritated. In the end, one of us approached him and told him, you know, that's enough, you can't talk anymore. And he started saying ridiculous things, and in the end he ended up with like a crazy sentence saying that, or asking rhetorically, it's like, do you know how scary a stone is when you're inside a tank? And everybody just laughed at him. So that was the first event. Of course, the SQHR members were inexperienced at the time. It was our first event. We didn't know how to deal with these issues, so we went to the AMS and we demanded an apology, and the AMS launched a mini investigation. In the end, they had to apologize to us, which was good. But that was their first attempt. And since then, you know, in between, they just kind of stopped coming to our events. And if they come, they send like 2 people in a suit, listen, and in the end, probably ask a question, you know, the same kind of question they ask all the time about, you know, Yasser Arafat's rejection of the generous offer. So it's the exact same question they come and ask every single time. So that was it. Their shenanigans only resurfaced when they had our first Israeli Apartheid Week in 2009, when they, along, you know, other pro-Israel clubs across Canada, demanded that the poster with the little Palestinian child and the helicopter be banned. So they asked the UBC administration to ban it, and I don't know why, but actually UBC didn't ban it. And either because they're nice, or because they thought, well, you know, they would give us more publicity than we would actually get if they just let us do our work. So in the end, they didn't ban it, and instead the president, Stephen Tuki, issued a statement on constructive dialogue, whatever that means. So that was it for the poster. And then they went again on sabbatical for a year, and they came back with a new president who, I don't know what was going on inside his head, but he thought he could stifle free speech and prevent us from doing our work. So what they did is they went to the administration, they went to the AMS administration first, and the president at the time was Blake Frederick, who's very progressive and pro-Palestine, and his execs were kind of progressive as well. So they went to complain to him, and of course he just didn't listen to them and dismissed their arguments. And then so they went to the UBC administration. And at Palestine Week, it's not Israeli Apartheid Week, it's a week we do the term before. We had a checkpoint, a mock checkpoint, and a little wall inside of the sub. So they complained that this is inflammatory, and they complained about safety. And said, how dare they block traffic inside the student union building? So they went. So that was their argument. So the VP for students office, they sent their senior administrator there. Her name is Jenny Peto, and she came and spoke to me. And I told her I really feel uncomfortable being in this meeting, and I feel that you're infringing on my right to talk about my cause. So she said, no, don't feel uncomfortable, we just want to talk about it, see what exactly you're doing, and don't worry, we're not going to ban anything. So I told her exactly what the project is, and I told her, you know, the checkpoint is nothing but a table that says checkpoint, and the wall is nothing but a cardboard that says wall. So she said that's fine. And I showed her the material, even though she didn't want to see what we were going to show. But I showed her the material we're gonna present during Palestine Week, and she said that's fine. In fact, after our meeting, she was so encouraged by the way we do things that she actually brought to me some of the posters that the IEC was going to put, you know, to argue against our material. And she came to me and said, "Is it okay for them to put it out?" I'm like, well, that's cool. So I'm like, okay, that's fine. So they put their posters out, because they're not really that smart, I don't know. They went and they gave them to the AMS office so that they put them out for them. And the AMS office put them the Tuesday after Israeli Palestine Week. So they really didn't work out for them. So that was their mini attempt. And then luckily for them, the AMS election happened the following term, and I personally didn't really pay much attention to the AMS election. and Bijan Ahmadian was running, and I didn't really know him at the time. And a day before the election or the voting ended, we got an email saying that the IEC endorses Bijan Ahmadian. He's a friend of Israel, unlike Blake Frederick, and he will satisfy the objectives of the IEC. And that's when I knew that things are going to be a lot difficult to happen in the following year. Anyways, the first thing that Bijan Ahmadian did before doing anything AMS related was to call me to his office. So he sent me an email. He's like, I'd like to meet with you, you're holding Israeli Apartheid Week, I've received complaints, I'd like to talk to you about it, blah, 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 blah. So I told him no. I didn't even, I just said no, and then that's it, hit send. And then he sent me another email, put in like a huge list of bylaws, one of them saying that he could actually ban the club. So I told him, well, ban SPHR, I don't care. I told him if he thinks that, the Palestinian cause is SPHR, I'll ban SPHR myself. It's not a big problem. So he didn't like that. So he sent me a third email insisting that he actually doesn't want to ban Israeli Apartheid Week or SPHR, and all he wants to do is talk about the cause. So I sent him another email. I'm like, if you really, really want to talk to me, just come to my office during my office hours. So he's like, no, I'm not going to do that. So I'm like, okay, I don't want to be stubborn. So I sent him an email. I said, I will only meet you if there's a representative from the university, and insisted that Jenny Peto will be there. So he said that's fine, even though he didn't like it because he thought it was, an AMS issue and the university should intervene. But I said, well, if you want to meet me, you can't really force me to come to your office. The only way you can meet me is with the administrator to be there. So he said that's fine. So he came and we went, and he decided that a story about his love to ballet will break the ice, whatever. And he started talking about Israeli Apartheid Week and how the term apartheid could be inflammatory and offensive and anti-Semitic and so on and so forth, all these stupid arguments. And I told him, listen, you can try, but we're not going to not have Israeli Apartheid Week, it will still happen. And I explained to him, what our intentions are and what we plan to do with Israeli Apartheid Week and what the definition of apartheid is and why we think it's an appropriate term to use. So we're actually pretty nice at the meeting. In the end, he asked me for a favor and to change it. Still have Israeli Apartheid Week, but change it to like Palestinian or whatever. So I said, no, we're not going to change it. And then he said, well, at least let me see the material for Israeli Apartheid Week, so I can tell the IEC that it's legit. So I told him to go to Human Rights Watch and check out our material. And then he's like, well, I'd like to see them beforehand. So I told him, no, you can't see them beforehand. He's like, well, you have to. You're an AMS club and you have to follow AMS bylaws. And that's when Jenny Peto, intervened and said, you're not allowed to censor anything that SPHR does. They're doing their Israeli Apartheid Week on university property, and it's under my jurisdiction, not yours, so you're not allowed to check their material. So he said, well, at least let me check the pictures you're going to put up. And she said, no, you can't check anything. So well, that was pretty nice of her. And then that's when the meeting ended. And in fact, I told him, come to Israeli Apartheid Week and check our material. It's not a big deal. And if you have any criticism, let me know. He didn't come. So that was it for Israeli Apartheid Week. So, of course, he failed. He probably went back to the IEC and told them, sorry guys, I couldn't do anything. The perfect opportunity came up when we asked the Social Justice Center out of UBC to give us a donation for the Canadian boat to Gaza. And at the time, we were kind of ambiguous in our request. We went into the SGC meeting because we know all the SGC members and we're friends with them. So we went and told them, hey, we're having this event for George Galloway to fundraise for the Canadian boat to Gaza. It would be awesome if you, give us a donation. And we asked for a lot of money, but they only gave us $700. So they approved the $700, and later on, the treasurer of SPHR came to me and told me there's a deposit of $550 in our account. So I'm like, okay, well then, whatever. So we forgot about it. And then later on, all of a sudden we find out that the donation was frozen. And we're like, what's up with that? It is in our account. But apparently it wasn't. And the reason we actually find out that it was frozen was when they came to our meeting, to the SJC meeting. There were like 15 to 17 of them. They came and they demanded that the donation be frozen to SPHR. And that's when we told them, no, the money is going to the Canadian boat to Gaza. In the beginning they claimed that they don't want to support George Galway because he supports 2 genocidal regimes and whatnot. He's anti-Semitic and a closet Muslim or not. So, of course, that failed. At that same meeting, the ombudsperson was there by accident. He was just passing by. And he saw the whole meeting. So he decided that he wants to mediate between SPHR and the IEC. So I'm like, that's fine. So two representatives from SJC went, including myself, and they brought their representatives, and they started talking about the issue. So their objections, the complaint they had, that George Galway supports genocidal regimes and they don't want the money to go to George Galway. And then the second complaint was that the Resource Center doesn't provide safe space for Israeli or Jewish pro-Israel neutral students. And it took us, we spoke about this whole thing for an hour. Of course, we had to retract the first complaint because we told them that the money isn't really going to the Canadian boat to Gaza. And the second complaint just didn't make any sense. How could you be neutral and pro-Israel at the same time? So the ombudsperson was like, sorry, I can't take this seriously. So he dismissed the complaint in its entirety. At the meeting, I realized that the people we're dealing with, they just don't know what they're doing. They're probably given a few catch lines by, what's his name? I forgot his name, the guy from the Hillel House.
Pat Johnson.
Pat Johnson, yeah. So he gave them a couple of catch lines, and I actually confronted them if they actually understand what Zionism is. They didn't even know what Zionism is. And I started explaining to them in that meeting what Zionism is. Like, you heard of Theodore Herzl? She's like, what? So that was it for the ombudsperson, and then they took it to the council. And at the council we had a 3-hour debate over the merits of the donation. They came and they presented ridiculous, arguments. Things like we have 200 signatures from students and 600 signatures from people that are not students, and probably most of them are from the UK anyways. We realized that later. They didn't really know what to say about the whole thing, and in the end the councillors weren't really convinced by their arguments, and we won the majority of the vote, even though we only needed half of the councillors to agree with us. But we got the majority nonetheless. And that's when Bijan decided that he wants to take it a step further. In fact, he asked for a legal opinion. He spent $13,000 in a legal opinion just to block a $700 donation. And he didn't even get the approval of the council. That's a thing. So we won at that council meeting. The second day, Bijan went to the VP Finance. We ordered him not to allow the donation go through till he actually investigates links between SPHR and terrorism. So that was kind of silly of him, and everybody was choked because we spoke to every single councillor, and even the people who voted against the motion thought that this was it. The money is going to go through and they're going to done with the whole situation. Of course, the VP Finance was angry with the whole situation. He doesn't really want to investigate terrorism because he doesn't know how. And then when he talked to thesis, they're like, "What, are you out of your mind?" So that was it. They came, 2 months later. They had a council meeting, and then they voted. Seti, actually, she's here. She presented a motion to allow the donation go through, and there were a few abstentions, but it was unanimous -1, and the only one who voted against the motion was Bijan Ahmadian, which is not a surprise. Anyways, so that was it. The donation went through. Very cool trivia throughout the whole thing. David Frum wrote an article about us, which is pretty cool. It's cool. David Frum knows me. So, should add that to my resume. And Tarek Lavin, some of you probably know Tarek Lavin, he also wrote an article in the National Post about us. So there were 2 articles in the National Post. McLean's wrote about 3 articles about the whole situation. Carlton newspaper, the student newspaper at Campbell University, who wrote an article about this issue. So that was pretty cool. But in the end, we won. Free speech won. The council members weren't persuaded by intimidation and fear-mongering. They were told that they're going to be liable if they allow money to go to terrorist groups like Hamas. They were told they're probably going to be sued. They were actually threatened by a lawsuit, but the councilor said, no, you can't really fool us. We're not, little kids. So that was really, really good. Brian is probably, I know he's going to provide some context as to why all of this is happening in relation to the anti-Semitism conference and the things that politicians have been doing in the past couple of years to ban pro-Palestine speech on campuses. So that's it for my turn. Thank you. I'm done.
Well, I'm going to be talking about the situation in Canada, but I want to begin by acknowledging that the attacks that we experience in Canada are nothing compared to the day-to-day violence that the people in the occupied territories experience, nor the people in Israel living under the apartheid system in Israel. What I want to argue here is that the incidents that Jenny is going to talk about and that Omar has talked about are not isolated incidents, but rather part of a multifaceted proxy war for the support of the international public. Israel's domestic policy towards Palestinians in the occupied territories, as well as Israeli Arabs and now the NGOs in Israel, is being directed externally towards its critics. Israel was given kind of a clear go card for 40 years after it was first founded in the shadows of the Holocaust, but increasingly since then, since the first Intifada, there have been criticisms of Israel and Israeli policy. So the combination of Palestinian resistance and external criticism and support for the Palestinian resistance has resulted in Israel feeling pressure for the first time. And this was especially the case since the 2006 attack on Lebanon, the Operation Cast Lead, the attack on the Mavi Marmara, and the Goldstone report. So now what you see is a country that's used to getting freedom to do whatever it wants and not being criticized, lashing out in all directions, because it is being called to account by the Palestinian resistance, foreign critics, and the BDS movement. Supporters of Israel have initiated a two-pronged attack outside of the Middle East. On one side is the Velvet Glove, attempting to rebrand Israel as a democratic, culturally diverse, tolerant of gender differences, and a fun place to visit. On the other side is the Iron Fist, attempting to criminalize criticism of Israel, while at the same time mounting legal attacks, campaigns of slander, censorship, smears, and false accusations, economic pressure, and bureaucratic harassment. And one of the things you can be sure of is there's very little concern for the truth in these attacks. So you read any of the articles that have been written, you read the letters that were directed to the AMS Council. The letters are 2 or 3 pages long, and it would take, 20 pages to correct everything in those letters that is just flagrantly wrong. Supporters of Israel have to try and shut down debate and discussion because they are not able to defend the indefensible. They're on the wrong side of history. The intention of the attacks is not necessarily to win, but to occupy their opponents and wear them out financially and in terms of human energy. The rhetorical trick is to force anyone who raises a specific factual criticism of Israel, let's say the bombing of Gaza and the killing of several hundred children, to answer the charge of anti-Semitism. So you say, this was a terrible thing, this was a massacre, you're an anti-Semite. And their hope then at that point is that you will try to defend yourself against the charge of anti-Semitism rather than their having to answer the charge that they've killed 400 people and massacred many more. What I want to talk about, though, is one strand of these multifaceted attempts to suppress criticism and advocacy, and it's one of the strands that has focused on campus work. One of the ongoing hoaxes perpetuated by supporters of Israel is the attempt to criminalize criticism of Israel by conflating it with anti-Semitism. Through a series of pseudo-parliamentary committees composed of volunteer pro-Israel parliamentarians, really lobbyists for Israel, that they've established in Britain, Canada, Australia, and other countries, and an international organization, they have attempted to get legislation passed which would criminalize criticism of Israel. One trick that they have used is that each conference references and builds on the work of previous conferences to pretend that there's an international consensus. In reality, there's only a handful of parliamentarians and academics that are leading this assault internationally. And Irwin Cotler, the former Liberal Justice Minister, is the linchpin internationally on this attempt, and many others. I was reading an article today. He's in the process of starting 4 other organizations. It's just unbelievable. Justice Ministers United for Israel. Oh, it's just incredible. The goal of the guy. Part of the hoax is to create names such as the Canadian Parliamentary Committee to Combat Anti-Semitism, which sounds official, but are not, and to make use of a definition of anti-Semitism that pro-Israeli organizations created through an organization called the European Union Monitoring Center, working definition of anti-Semitism. So you can't get much more burdened with officialese than that title, can you? What you don't know, and what an academic, Dr. Susan Blackwell, looked at how the definition was created and concluded that the American Jewish Congress and the European Jewish Congress had, an academic could say, a disproportionate influence, both directly and indirectly, on the contents and prestige of the definition. In reality, there were only Zionists that were involved in this, as far as we've been able to tell. And they gave a definition for anti-Semitism, which I don't have time to go into, except that one of their follow-up statements was, in addition, such manifestations could also target the state of Israel, conceived as the Jewish collectivity. So now we're expanding this definition of anti-Semitism, criticism of the Jewish state. An ongoing theme of all these conferences and committees has been the reemergence of anti-Semitism, new anti-Semitism, particularly on the campuses where young people are joining Solidarity and BDS organizations. Everybody knows what BDS is, right? I don't have to. Oh, stuck together here. So the Interparliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism was the first conference they held internationally, and it was in London in 2009. And it brought together representatives from a number of different countries. Again, it's the Interparliamentary Coalition. One, again, thinks it's official, but these were all volunteers from all these various countries. One person from Italy, one person from a country in Africa, one person from Lebanon, so on and so forth. Among its recommendations was legislate effective hate crime legislation, recognizing hate-aggravated crimes and the incitement to hatred offenses, and empower law enforcement agencies to convict, keeping in mind that they want to make criticism of Israel a hate crime. They want to make it a broader definition of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism a hate crime. And they added, educational authorities should ensure that freedom of speech is upheld within the law and to protect students and staff from illegal anti-Semitic discourse and a hostile environment in whatever form it takes, including calls for boycotts. Again, the definition just keeps getting broader and broader. In Canada, the Canadian Parliamentary Committee to Combat Anti-Semitism was formed by 21 volunteer pro-Israeli MPs from all parties. They asked for submissions, they got submissions, they were surprised at how many people responded that they didn't believe in the mandate of the committee and didn't agree with the attempts at anti-Semitism, expanded anti-Semitism. And they created public hearings, and they only invited, with one exception, people that supported their position, and as a result, the Bloc Québécois dropped out of the committee, but not the NDP. The CPCCA claimed that anti-Semitism is at its worst level since the end of the Second World War. However, Bernie Farber, the CEO of the Canadian Jewish Congress, just a few weeks before said, "We've come to a point in the 21st century where, at least in the halls of government, and I think very much in the mainstream of Canadian life, we're viewed as part and parcel of the Canadian polity." And one of the things that they really wanted to do at the CPCCA hearings was prove that there was an upsurge of anti-Semitism on the campuses. So they invited some university presidents, and some of them came, and most of them sent second-tier people to the hearings. But the assistant vice president of the U of T testified, "There's no evidence of generalized anti-Semitism on the U of T campuses. There's no evidence of Jewish students being systematically harassed and intimidated on our campuses. There is no evidence that it is dangerous to be pro-Israeli student, faculty members, or staff member on our campuses. In fact, quite the opposite is the case." And Professor Emeritus of Concordia University said, "Canadian campuses are safe. They are not hotbeds of anti-Semitism or racism of any kind, although, of course, these conditions do occur." This is the fellow that was the president of Concordia University, which has a certain historic significance. As a result of this and broad spread opposition from a number of organizations, the CPC has not released its report, which was due last spring. However, the CPCCA and the Ministry of Immigration and Multiculturalism sponsored a $451,000 international conference in Ottawa that produced the Ottawa Protocol, which says there continues to be a dramatic increase in recorded anti-Semitic hate crimes. It's very interesting. You can say one thing and document it up the yin-yang, and they'll turn around and say exactly the opposite as if nothing has happened. That's the way it was at the UBC AMS discussions. They expressed concern at the reported incidents of anti-Semitism on the campuses, such as acts of violence, verbal abuse, rank intolerance, and assaults in those committed to free inquiry. That is, and we've heard the description before, you're neutral if you're pro-Israel. So free inquiry is starting from the Israeli position, while undermining fundamental academic values. Now here comes the key thing. Our recommendation is to work with universities to ensure that they combat anti-Semitism with the same seriousness with which they confront other forms of hate, like Islamophobia, racism against natives, attacks against South Asians. They're all so much higher than anti-Semitism in terms of the way campuses deal with it. Specifically, universities should be invited to define anti-Semitism clearly and enforce codes of conduct. And this is one of the ways they get things onto the campus and suppress discussion on the campus is through codes of conduct. Universities should use the EUMC working definition, i.e. the expanded definition, equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. Indeed, there should be zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind on the basis of race, gender, religion, ethnic orientation, sexual orientation, or political position. So we have had all these platitudes about intellectual freedom and freedom of information. What is the reality? How am I doing here? 7 minutes? Okay, good. So I've got a full page here of examples of attacks on people that supported Palestine or criticized Israel. I'm obviously not going to go through them all. But that gives you some sense of how they see free public inquiry. So one that I kind of liked is Rena Katz was recently disassociated from the Koffler Center of the Arts in Toronto because of her work with Kaya. And Adbusters was recently withdrawn from Shoppers Drug Mart, 3,500 issues of Adbusters, and they won't carry it anymore. because they showed photos juxtaposing the Warsaw Ghetto and Gaza. Incidentally, Murray Koffler founded Shoppers Drug Mart, the same person who funded the art gallery. There were smear campaigns against the Ontario branch of CUPE for daring to discuss the issue of academic boycott. There was a quite harsh attack on the president of York University for allowing George Galloway to speak on the campus last fall. So harsh that the university threatened legal action in defense of the president of the university. Just recently, Christopher Pedersen-Overton, the adjunct professor who lost his job teaching a Middle East politics course at Brooklyn College after a student and a local politician criticized his views in Israel, and has now been rehired. Just one other that during the summer of 2008, 8 university presidents were given free trips to Israel. And if you look at the Hillel Center on campus, their program is providing free trips to Israel for all kinds of students, and free training programs and Holocaust education programs, which we'll hear more about that. Now, I'm happy to report, as you go down through the list, the vast majority of these attempts were defeated by broad public activity. Kaya got into the Gay Pride Parade. Chris Overton was rehired. Shireen Razak didn't lose her job, which is a victory. George Galloway came to Canada. Cam West, which I haven't mentioned, which is how Seriously Free Speech started, trying to sue people for producing a parody of the Vancouver Sun. The case is in bureaucratic limbo and they've had to set it aside. So again and again, strong public action has reversed decisions that were made. Now there have been, unfortunately, some losses. People like Norman Finkelstein and Joel Colville lost their jobs permanently. We need to continue that at the same multiplicity of levels that Israel is attacking organizations. Seriously Free Speech focuses on the free speech implications and defending people that have been attacked. Every battle that Israel initiates is a public education opportunity for us. Every battle that they lose, as a consequence, is more support for Palestine and more support for open discussion on the Middle East. And they have to lose the majority of battles they start. First of all, they're not used to really fighting. They're used to the elites doing their work for them. And because they are fighting against history, they are taking a position that's indefensible. And as a consequence, in the long run, they can't win. What we have to learn to do is move from the reactive defensive positions that we've been taking and move on to the offensive against Israel and pro-Israeli supporters. Thank you very much.
How's everybody doing? Good? Yeah. Seriously, come on, it's a pretty impressive time to be alive, right? So you've got the Mubarak regime falling, a bus just called elections, Sam Ericat just resigned. It's a good day. Things are happening here. I want to thank all the groups that sponsored this and sponsored my trip, and it's been amazing being here in Vancouver and getting to meet with different groups of people. It's been awesome, and not just because it's like 30 degrees warmer here, which is nice, by the way. I know it rained, but it's still really nice. So I've been given about 20 to 30 minutes, which is a long time. But given the purpose of this event, I'm not going to necessarily get into what my master's research was about specifically. I can talk about it in the Q&A and things like that, but since we're talking about the issue of repression, that's what I'm going to focus on. It's also kind of hard to synthesize over 100 pages of academic research in a soundbite, which the media has been trying to get me to do. It's really not easy. Some of you may have read it, others of you may have not, but don't worry, most of the people who attack me haven't read it either. But you can access it online. You can just Google it like they did. And I'd like to think it's not written in hyper-academic language. Maybe I wouldn't be in this situation if I'd used obscure weird theorists and written it like Gramsci or something like that. But no, I tried to make it accessible and in some ways an activist resource. So feel free to take a look at it. What I am going to talk tonight about is how what happened to me in my thesis fits into the larger issue of repression of Palestinian and pro-Palestinian activists in Canada, and how that affects the work that we do. And in my case, in the case of the Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid, the work that we really do is answering the 2005 call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israeli apartheid. And so, even though so many of the attacks on me have been deeply and almost comically personal, I really, really believe that Peto-gate, that's what we're calling it back home, is not about me, and it's not even really about my thesis. And I think what it's about is the desperation of pro-Israel groups. And you can see it. They're frantically, and I mean frantically, trying to crush criticism of Israel, and especially the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And they're trying to do it through bullying and intimidation. That is their tactic. And similar to what Brian was saying before I get going, I think it's really, really, really important to emphasize that when we're talking about repression in Canada, those of us that are not Palestinian like myself, especially people like me who enjoy white privilege as middle class people with Canadian citizens, settlers on this territory, I think it's really important that we acknowledge when we're attacked, we don't face the same consequences as Palestinians, as Indigenous people, as folks of color. So repression against someone like me in Canada probably means a character assassination, but it can mean real assassinations for other people. So, I grew up in Ontario, and I remember very vividly when Douglas George, he was executed by the Canadian state for defending his land. And for people, in Palestine as well, that repression often can actually mean targeted assassination. So there is some gravity to this, and I think you need to approach it with humility. And I think, that's an important point we kind of overlook when we're swept up in these attacks, because they can be so time-consuming. And I think it's really important to talk about repression as kind of a spectrum of violence, all aimed at silencing dissent. So I'm coming in here from Toronto, where this summer, I'm sure all of you caught the news, the average Torontonian got a glimpse of the Canadian state, and they saw 1,000 people in our city rounded up and locked away. And when we were responding to that violence there, we actually really struggled with how do we talk about how bad what happened in the G20 was, while keeping, first and foremost, that this is the kind of violence people on reserve, people in poor communities know day in and day out. And it was a really, really, really hard struggle, and I think that you run into that whenever you talk about issues like civil liberties and the right to protest, the right to dissent. And so, I think that's something we're constantly going to be struggling with. And in doing Palestine work, we really need to talk about repression in Palestine. There's over 10,000 Palestinian political prisoners being held by the Israeli state, many of whom are children. Israel practices administrative detention, where you can be held basically indefinitely without trial. And that's happened to many of our friends and comrades. More and more BDS activists are being targeted, and they're being arrested, tortured, and detained without even access to basic legal representation. And I think what happened on the Mavi Marmara was a case of state repression, right? So people trying to do something as basic as bringing aid and food and the necessities of life were murdered on the high seas, basically. And I think we need to keep in mind that collective punishment of Palestinians is a really, really, really key pillar of Israeli apartheid. So, I got attacked in the newspapers, mostly the National Post, which is hard to call a newspaper. And I got made fun of by the members of the Ontario Parliament, the Ontario Legislature, but I know I'm not going to end up in prison. I'm not going to get tortured or killed for speaking out against Israeli apartheid. But there are others who face those very real consequences, and especially following the tremendous vision of people power in Egypt, we need to draw inspiration from people who face those real consequences. And for me, definitely doing Palestine work, I look at the 62 years of Palestinian resistance and draw so much strength from that, because if they keep fighting against what they're fighting against, then we better keep on fighting too. So to kind of get into it, to give you all some background about what happened, I'm just going to try to sum it up pretty briefly. So I finally graduated in June of 2009, and U of T no longer requires you to bind your thesis. You used to bind your thesis and you used to sit on a shelf in the library until I think they recycled them or something. But now you PDF your thesis and you stick it up online for everyone to find. And I think that's a good thing, access to information. But what happened to me was a right-wing blogger was Googling me and stumbled onto my thesis. And it's not a coincidence that he was looking me up. So, in Toronto, I'm a pretty well-known pro-Palestine activist. I'm very involved with the Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid, and I was one of the spokespeople for Queers Against Israeli Apartheid when we were under attack last summer. And so as he found this, he thought he hit the jackpot, and he started blogging about it. Another blogger picked it up, and then not, of course, to be left out of the fun, the National Post decided to publish that blog, because that counts as journalism, apparently. And the blog post that the National Post published was filled with quite a bit of misinformation, and I contacted them and said, look, I'll go to the press council, you have to at least let me respond. And they published my response online, and I thought, all right, some right-wing shenanigans, what's done is done, I'll kind of chalk this up to experience and move on. But what happened next, no, I don't think I could have predicted. So the Canadian Jewish News picked up the story, and I think that's when it started, the pro-Israel groups kind of whipped into a frenzy. A few weeks later, I was contacted by the Toronto Star, and they would want to interview, and I said, all right. And then it was on the front page of the Greater Toronto Area section of the Toronto Star. They, instead of taking a picture of me, they found a picture from when I was arrested occupying the Israeli consulate. So I looked like a fist in the air and surrounded by cops and crazy activists. That was a pretty good picture, but maybe my coworkers didn't feel the same way. And that same day, not coincidentally, was the day that I was condemned in the Ontario legislature. So the Star got to be like, look, oh, coincidence, and then they got a second or third story out of the whole thing, and at that point the story got picked up by all the major news outlets. And although I'll give them credit, the National Post ran with this for a really, really, really long time. Like, it was article upon article. They got a bit weirder as it went on, and Jonathan Kay got totally carried away, and his mom got even more carried away. And it went on for weeks and weeks. It was totally strange. I mean, I think I'm interesting, but I'm not that. It's not possible. And so I've been asked by a lot of people. I think one of the biggest questions was, did you expect this? Did it catch you by surprise? And I mean, it's pretty shocking to see this happen to a master's thesis, right? You talk to most people. No, I mean, I love the academy, don't get me wrong. What we do is so important. But you talk to most people with an MA, even a PhD, and they're like, how many people have read your thesis? And they're like, they'll look down awkwardly and be like, well, my supervisor, my mom, didn't really get through it. And so they kind of tend to fade into obscurity. And I think mine would have suffered that same fate if it weren't who I am. And I'm a pro-Palestine activist. And so they know me, right? They know me for being part of Kaya. They know me for having been involved as an organizer and having spoken at Israeli Apartheid Week. They knew me from Quaya, and they also knew me from the occupation of the Israeli consulate. And that's why I was singled out, right? I'm not naive, right? I wrote a thesis that was critical of Holocaust education. I did a critical, anti-racist analysis of how Jews became white people, and I asked a lot of really, really difficult questions. And again, not to be self-deprecating, but I'm not the first person to have done this, right? Like, it's not the first time these ideas have been thrown around. There's a movie called Defamation, which actually goes on and documents the trip, the March of the Living, one of the trips that I critiqued. And when I watched it, I was like, oh, I just finished my thesis. This would have been good to cite, because he's kind of saying the same thing I am. Dozens of articles, several books have been written about the use of Holocaust memory to justify Israeli apartheid, including a book by Avram Burg, who's a former speaker of the Israeli Knesset, right? So again, like all MA students, we think we're amazing, we're trailblazing, we're prodigies, but you build on the work of others, right? That's what you do at the master's level. So I'm being attacked not because these are new ideas, because I'm the first person to do it, but I'm being attacked because I talk openly, and I work with groups that talk openly, and I think really articulately and convincingly about Israeli apartheid. And I'm a target because I'm part of the growing campaign for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which pro-Israel groups are completely freaking out about, right? They've just dedicated $6 million to fighting BDS. That is a lot of flyers and videos and things like that. And I think also I'm being attacked because I do all this despite 18 years of Zionist brainwashing. Like, I grew up in Thornhill, just north of Toronto, which is an incredibly pro-Israel environment. I went to Zionist schools, I went to Zionist camps, I went to Zionist synagogues, I was inundated with it, and I came out like this. Is that I'm a failed product of their system, right? And they're worried. They're frantically trying to figure out, like, what the hell went wrong in this case. And I don't know what they're wrong, but judging from the attacks and some of the comments and some of the hate mail, this was also a really homophobic attack. Absolutely, I think my involvement with Quaya was probably the linchpin in this. Because no matter what the PR and no matter what the rebranding campaigns will tell you, growing up queer and genderqueer in an Orthodox Jewish community sucks, and it's the same as growing up in any conservative community when you're queer or just sort of against the grain. And so in all of this, I think probably the most dangerous, the most alarming part of the saga with my thesis isn't the media attacks and the blogosphere, which I don't dare to venture into anymore. I think the most worrisome part is what happened in the legislature. Because according to various experts who really write about academic freedom, this is unprecedented. It's the first time that they can find that a Canadian master's student was criticized by a government body, right? And so, when this was initially going on and the attacks in the media were happening and I was getting made fun of and criticized, I was like, okay, well, we made fun of it on Facebook and we joked about it and kind of, but when it hit the legislature, we knew it had been kicked up a notch, and that's when we decided to spring into political action. And so what happened was, Faculty for Palestine, which is an amazing group of faculty members who do incredible work, they issued a call out and they got people to write letters to members of provincial parliament and the head of all three provincial parties condemning this attack. And hundreds of individuals responded. People from across the country, from around the world, wrote letters. The MPPs wrote back, and people wrote back to the MPPs. It's been, kind of really amazing. And when the call went out, PACU, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel in Palestine, endorsed the call from Faculty for Palestine. The Canadian Association of University Teachers has really had my back on this one. The Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations wrote a really strong letter in defense of academic freedom, as did the Committee on Academic Freedom of the Middle East Studies Association of North America. And so this really did rally the troops around academic freedom, and this wasn't the first time that they'd seen this. And so again, because of these attacks, we have all these things in the wings. And I think the reason that people were so alarmed, because they get what the point of this is, and the point of this is to send a chill through the academic world, right? This message is loud and clear. Don't talk about Israeli apartheid, or you're going to face some serious consequences, right? Like, this is trying to scare the crap out of everyone. And so the mobilization around my case was, like, I can't even thank people enough for how incredible that support was on a personal level. But I think it's actually more significant for students and faculty that are coming after me that see this and may have been afraid, right? And may not wanted to pursue their studies or lecture on these issues. And so when we counteract this in such a strong and powerful way, we counteract that chilling effect. And that's really important. But again, I think these kind of things go beyond the issues of censorship and academic freedom. And what we need to do when we're talking about free speech and we're talking about repression is, we can't emphasize enough that censorship is always a power relationship. It's never neutral, right? Like, none of us can imagine a racist or Islamophobic thesis, and believe me, tons of them come out of all sorts of institutions. Mine, that's fine departments, also gives plenty of them out there. Can you imagine it getting denounced like that, right? Can you imagine the Ontario legislature being like, someone wrote something Islamophobic? You can't even picture it, because that's not how censorship works, right? Censorship is always political, and it's always a move by the powerful. And repression is about maintaining the status quo. And in Canada, we can't forget that status quo is uncritical support of Israel. The status quo is billions of dollars of free trade between the two countries, most of it military trade. And so our fight shouldn't be focused on repression and free speech, but it should be focused on the power structures that not only facilitate, but thrive from that repression. So we shouldn't get stuck in the trap of only talking about our right to be activists, right? And that can happen. Our best fight back is to continue to do our work. And when this repression comes up, we should use it to our advantage. We should use this to bring attention to issues in Palestine and to say to those people, are you frustrated about this? Are you frustrated about these attacks on free speech? The solution is to fight back against the people that are doing it, and the best way to fight back is to boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And I think we need to remember, because it can get disheartening, especially when you're in the thick of it, that every time the Zionists act like bullies, and they cause this enormous fuss that is completely disproportional to what was going on, a $700 donation, a little master's thesis, more and more people are seeing through it, right? And they're seeing this as a false claim of victimization, right? Because you have these people exercising tremendous amount of power, getting MPPs to speak up, and all the while claiming that they're incredibly persecuted. Like, it's kind of funny, the title of my thesis is The Victimhood of the Powerful, and they're fully acting this out, right? And I kept saying that, they're like, what would you do differently? And I'm like, I would write an epilogue about this. Like, it completely proves my point, right? And I think when these attacks happen, people see the injustice, and they see it happening to an individual, to a group, and they're really sympathetic towards those that are singled out. So I got a lot of support when Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, Kwaya, was being attacked. The outpouring of support was tremendous. But I think it's our job in those moments as activists to move those people who are so upset about these violations of civil liberties and take them beyond the question of censorship to the question of Palestine. And we need to link the repression we face to the important issue of Canadian complicity in Israeli apartheid. Now, luckily for us, the Zionists and Israel supporters kind of do the work for us in making these links. And what I kind of want to do is actually read the transcript from the legislature, because it's just brilliant the way that they do the work for us. So it started out with Steve Clark, a conservative member of provincial parliament, and he starts off and he says, "My question is for the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration. Minister, Jewish groups are criticizing the University of Toronto for accepting a shockingly anti-Semitic master's thesis. Minister, this House unanimously passed a resolution from the member from Thornhill condemning Israeli Apartheid Week. What are you doing as Minister of Citizenship and Immigration to stop the rising tide of anti-Semitism?" So Eric Hoskins, who's a Liberal member of provincial parliament, instead of being like, academic freedom, stop talking about this, says, "I deeply appreciate the member opposite for raising this. I too was greatly disturbed and in fact disgusted when I read the immediate reports, not the thesis, the immediate reports as well. I want to say first and foremost that this government remains absolutely committed to fighting discrimination in all its forms." That's not actually true. I want to add that the McGuinty government, they just refuse to raise minimum wage. Like this is the government. I want to add as well that the McGuinty government denounces all acts of anti-Semitism, which we believe is a particularly vile and pernicious form of discrimination, and we will continue to work to protect the human rights of our Jewish community and all Ontarians. I was proud that this legislature earlier this year in fact came together to condemn anti-Semitism on our university campuses, and we will continue to work hard on behalf of all Ontarians, including our Jewish community, which he apparently has decided I'm no longer part of. So not to be left out, Peter Sherman, the member of the Knesset who happens to be sitting in the provincial, I mean he's unbelievable the things he's done for Israel while sitting as an MPP in Ontario. He has to chime in and he says, "I wish I could say that this hateful and poorly researched paper attacking programs that use the horrors of the Holocaust to somehow show the dangers of discrimination and racism by Jews was an isolated incident. Unfortunately, it's only the latest example that we've seen. Minister, will you today speak up on behalf of Jewish groups who have been so deeply hurt by this piece of garbage and condemn it not as an academic paper, but for the hate that it actually is?" And again, Hoskins, getting the last word, says, "Well, again, I appreciate the question from the member opposite. I join them in condemning this attack on Ontario's Jewish community. I want to reiterate that, as I mentioned, I was very proud earlier this year when the legislature came together to condemn anti-Semitism on our campuses. I also want to add that the State of Israel is a very good friend of the province of Ontario. I had the privilege of visiting Israel earlier this year with the Premier and a number of members of the Liberal caucus and of this government to improve our ties," right? So there's a lot going on in here, obviously. The conflation of anti-Semitism and criticism of the State of Israel is absolutely ridiculous. In fact, Hoskins keeps saying they condemned anti-Semitism when what they did was condemn Israeli Apartheid Week. But I think that's the point, right? My crime isn't anti-Semitism. Nothing about my work is in any way anti-Semitic. Like, I'm a social justice activist, right? I'm committed to anti-oppression, which includes a lot of fights as well as fighting against anti-Semitism. But you see, what I did, my crime, was that I criticized their good friend, the State of Israel, and I'm paying the price for that. And I think it's important to see how seamlessly they make the connection between condemning Israeli Apartheid Week, which they did last year, condemning me, and Israel being a good friend of Ontario. And I think you can't make a better argument for boycott, divestment, and sanctions than the one that presented here by my members of parliament, right? So economic ties to Israel are what this really boils down to, and they say it outright. Ontario is working really, really hard to increase its economic links to Israel at the same time that they're going after pro-Palestinian activists, and I think that's a really key point, right? Canadian support for Israel, it's complex, right? It's in part ideological. Settler colonial nations with histories of ethnic cleansing and genocide sure have a lot in common, and they need to defend the shared legacies of that brutality from each other, right? I mean, South African apartheid was modeled on the Canadian reservation system, and Israeli apartheid is very similar. So, these things are all connected. They're strong, racist, colonial, ideological shared roots there. Also, there's the issue of the pro-Israel lobby, which does have their influence. So, Peter Sherman is pandering to his very pro-Israel writing. I know that's the writing that I grew up in. And there's also a growing sort of evangelical Zionism in Canada. And these are people who are deeply anti-Semitic, and they believe that all Jews need to go back to Israel so that the rapture will happen. And they're being courted by the Israeli state and by groups like B'nai B'rith. It's a really, really messed up situation. But Again, this is a lot about empire, it's a lot about economics, and it's a lot about geopolitics, and we know very well that Israel has acted as a proxy army for the West for years, and so they're very, very central to the military-industrial complex. When Vancouver was being fortified for the Olympics, when Toronto was being fortified for the G20, so much of that technology was developed by Israel, right? They treat the West Bank and Gaza like a weapons laboratory, and they're the world leaders in homeland security, right? And so obviously they're gonna defend those interests. And so the more successful BDS is, the more these attacks are going to happen. They're gonna happen proportionally. And you can see that there's a very, very clear pattern that has emerged. So the attack on my thesis, as we've talked about, was not an isolated incident, and we're seeing an escalation in these attacks on Palestine organizing. Outside, there are some copies of a report that was put together by the Palestine Freedom of Expression campaign, sort of documenting these attacks. It's actually really comprehensive. It's available on the web as well if you can't grab a copy, but it kind of gives a good analysis of this. And you know, again, some of these attacks were the defunding of the Canadian Arab Federation and Kairos were really, really significant. The condemnation of Israeli Apartheid Week happening in the Ontario legislature, Michael Ignatieff did that. The poster for IAW in 2009 was banned in U of O, University of Ottawa, Carleton. And again, it was interesting. No one said anything about the massacre of 430 children in Gaza, but they sure had a lot to say about the poster depicting it. There was a conference at York University that was debating the one-state versus two-state solution in Israel-Palestine, and that conference came under an unprecedented attack. So SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, is one of like the major granting bodies in Canada, and it's at arm's length from the government. And it's really hard to get a SSHRC grant. It's extremely competitive. And that conference, I think, ranked in like the 98th percentile of the proposal, and they got a SSHRC grant for this. And when the pro-Israel groups found out about this, they lobbied the government, and the minister responsible for education and training, and again, an unprecedented move, contacted SSHRC, which is supposed to be at arm's length. It's a major attack on academic freedom, and demanded that they investigate the conference, right? And so the organizers were asked to submit all sorts of documentation that no one's ever had to submit on a conference that was daring just to even talk about the possibilities of one state versus two states. And again, a lot of people in the academic world rallied around that conference. You all know about, you know, George Galloway, and it's interesting listening to the stuff at UBC because students against Israeli apartheid that I've worked with at U of T and York have experienced so much repression, whether it's canceling of room bookings, trying to charge security fees when we're being attacked by the Jewish Defense League. I don't think they're active here, but wow, they're just like a bunch of thugs that come to our events and try to beat people up, and we have to pay for protection from them, which we, you know, obviously refuse to do. And again, if you guys have questions about any of these attacks and things, I've been involved in a lot of them, so you can ask them in the question and answer period, especially with what happened around Pride Toronto. But you know, it always comes back to this. Okay, so we talk about these really difficult stories, and we hear about the repression. We feel like, okay, what can we do? And so, you know, I want to return to my earlier point about repression, and I think, you know, it's really important to remember that censorship is about power. And with that understanding, we have to target those power structures and the powerful that benefit from censorship. So we have events like these where we talk about repression, but it's the other work that we do. It's the work fighting Canadian complicity and profit from Israeli apartheid that's the best way to fight that repression, right? To just continue to do our work. And what we do is we stand up to bullying and we show others that you can survive a Zionist attack and even thrive afterward. That's part of why I'm here, because so many people were concerned for me personally. I got so many emails being like, are you okay? You know what? I'm okay. You can get through it. You know, it is possible. We take advantage of the attention garnered by Zionist manufactured controversies. And what we do in those moments is, yes, we educate, but we also mobilize. And that's the big challenge we have as activists, is how do we use those moments to mobilize people and bring them together to challenge, you know, the Canadian government, the Israeli government. And what we need to do is we need to find those people who are moved to anger at censorship and threats to academic freedom and get them to also be angry about Israeli apartheid, right? Because that's far, far worse. And I think, again, I can't stress this enough, we fight back day in and day out by continuing to do the important work that we do. And then I get it, right? I know this can be disheartening, but I can totally assure you the Zionists are not winning this battle, right? So think about it. The controversy with my thesis led to a bunch of people reading my thesis. And it includes a lot of complex arguments, but in there, you know, thanks to my supervisors, like, you should put this in there. There's like 5 or 6 pages, all footnoted and documented, where I argue why Israel is an apartheid state. And that's an unintended consequence for the Zionists. Now, a bunch of people have read it, and they can go to the links in my footnotes and learn more about it, and they're now much more armed to defend why, you know, we shouldn't just talk about free speech around Israeli apartheid. It's accurate speech. It's an accurate analogy, and now more people know how to defend it. And I think the fact that I'm still standing here, the fact that we're all still standing here and speaking out despite threats and intimidation, proves to people that you can get through this when you're surrounded by an incredible activist community. And, you know, again, I'm not an extraordinary person, I'm not even particularly strong, but my community and being linked into this movement, that is an incredible, incredible sense of power. And the support that I receive, like I've never in my life felt like more people had my back than when this happened. And I think that's part of it too, is community building and movement building. And it's so, so, so important in all the work that we do, from migrant justice to anti-colonial work, anti-poverty work, all of our solidarity movements. The community sense is so important. And so every time I talk, I think it's so important to thank everybody who's rallied around me and who stood up to these bullies shoulder to shoulder with me, right? And their bullying and intimidation is completely backfiring. And they lose public support with every Israeli war crime in Palestine, and with every act of censorship here. They lose more and more people. And they attack us this way because they have absolutely no other line of defense. And this is so important. Israel is a state that on a day-to-day basis carries out brutal acts of violence and displacement. Just over 2 years ago, they were wrapping up their brutal military assault on Gaza, which definitely opened up the world's eyes because there were 1,400 people killed, including 430 children, right? The world couldn't ignore that anymore. Back in December, they used so much tear gas against the people of Bil'in that they killed a young woman whose brother they had killed 2 years earlier. Israel is a state built on the violence of over 60 years of ethnic cleansing that has seen refugees locked out of their homeland and forced to live in deplorable camps or without status all over the world. Israel is a state that hides behind F-16s, white phosphorus, naval commando units storming aid ships, and they do all of it with Canada's full support. So we here have a fundamental responsibility to use any means necessary to put a dent in that impunity enjoyed by the Israeli state. And we do that by continuing to take risks in spite of whatever they're going to throw at us. And it's becoming clearer and clearer that the pro-Israel lobby is getting more desperate, and they're getting desperate because they know they can't silence us. They know they can't stop the movement to end Israeli apartheid. So I'm going to be here, and I know you guys are going to all be here, and we're going to keep fighting until Israeli apartheid ends and Palestine is free. Thank you.
Yes!
Let me address the question to Campbell. In George Bernard Shaw's play, Arms and a Man, am I speaking something esoteric?
I just can't hear
Okay, I just Bernard Shaw, okay, that's one, Arms and a Man, you don't know the story. And it is when there's two antagonists. The private, the chocolate soldier, Blancy, and the major, who think that he is more elite, superior, and challenging Blancy to a duel. The subject, the subject of the dispute was the hand of Ranina, Iran. So to make it very short, is that Blancy said that. To duel, the pistol duel. And Bransley said that I don't want to fight you, but if you want to force me to fight you, and I'm standing up for my right, then if I'm going to battle, if I'm going to fight you, then I choose my own battle. I will choose my own weapon, not the weapon that you impose on me. So I'm answering a question to you. Other than this kind of confronting the Israeli, the Zionists, the right wing, what effective weapons do you have in mind to fight with? Because, as I said, we don't have the resources, the financial clout, the resources to fight them. And like you, I have been a social activist for 40 years. Ever since I wrote a paper in my undergraduate years and questioning John F. K., the Alliance for Progress.
We're going to ask that the questions be kept short, sorry.
So I know what you're thinking. I suffer from the kind of things like Prometheus being kept on being punished by the gods with it. So what do you have in mind? What do you have in mind?
Okay, so you're sort of just, I just want to make sure, because it's hard to hear, that you're asking like what weapons do we have, I guess, to fight back, not literal weapons.
That's right.
Sorry, some paranoid times back home. I think, years and years ago, it would have been really difficult to answer that question 5, 6, 7 years ago. But again, I can't say this enough. Like the 2005 call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions has given us such a powerful, again, metaphorical, nonviolent arsenal, and because it's a direct call out to the world community saying, look, your governments are supporting this, your governments are allowing this to happen, enabling it to happen, and times ordering it to happen, so you guys need to take responsibility for where you are. And so, that's the tool that's what we've been asked to do, and so that's what we should be doing. So, we're talking about this a bit at UBC, like what's the next step? And so, okay, so if you're under attack on your campus, then you try to get a divestment campaign at your campus, like what Carleton University has done, right? You find your university's ties to the weapons manufacturers that are building the weapons that are being used in Israel and around the world. You find those research links, those academic links, and you call for divestment for your universities. And you start doing that activism. And the beauty about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign is that it's concrete. It gives you, very practical things to do that can lead to victories, right? So the BDS movement, in such a short time, has been tremendously successful. I mean, as much as the Zionists try to say it hasn't, it has. So, 5 or 6 years ago, QP Ontario passed Resolution 50, which was the first boycott, divestment, and sanctions resolution in a union, and then the Canadian Union of Postal Workers followed up with that. There are several unions in Quebec that have passed boycott, divestment, and sanctions resolutions, like the CSQ, SAFE, FNEC. The labor union in Quebec is light years ahead. Quebec Solidaire, which is a political party, has endorsed BDS. And there have been significant victories that have happened. And there was sort of debate about is it a victory or not, but Ahava products were dropped from the Hudson's Bay Company, right? And they said, oh, it's because they're not profitable, not because it has anything to do with Israel. Well, why did they suddenly become not profitable, right? Well, because groups like Tadaman started it in Montreal, Copink has been doing it for a while all over the world, Kai's done some actions, and then CJPME put out the call. So we made it not profitable, right? And that's a major victory, right? And I think, so it's about plugging in and finding those links to Israel and following the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions from Palestine. And I think that's the tool in our arsenal, and it has tremendous educational value too. Like right now, there's a picket of a shoe store in Montreal because they carry nut sandals, which are Israeli sandals. And it's led to so much media coverage, right? And what's interesting is the fear that was kicked up. There was actually a positive article about BDS in the Toronto Star. Some guy being like, look, boycotts are not hateful, they raise awareness. Look at this, it was on the front page of the Toronto Star. There's a boycott of Israel, now more people know about it. So again, we actually have something concrete that we can really sink our teeth into, and it's finding the ways of doing that and linking up with groups that are doing that, and I think it's tremendous. And also organizing Israeli Apartheid Week. Nothing gets to them more than Israeli Apartheid Week. It drives them bonkers.
I'm just wondering what the response was from U of T to the government claiming they accepted a master's thesis that was in.
Sure. It was really interesting. I was like, oh, what's U of T going to do about it? Because U of T has a pretty bad track record on a lot of things, but particularly on Palestine. So they have a history of charging security fees to the Ontario Public Interest Research Group and Students Against Israeli Apartheid. Anytime they had an Arab or Muslim-sounding speaker, they would charge security fees that they stood up for and never paid. If you look on, it was published on Rabble, an article because we'd done a Freedom of Information request when a room booking had been canceled, and it's unbelievable the things that the university was pulling together to try to stop us from meeting on campus. And they give us a run for our money every time we do something. They allow the Jewish Defense League onto campus. The event that we had around the Palestine Freedom of Expression campaign, and OPERC Toronto put together an event, and it was supposed to be in one building. U of T moved it 2 or 3 hours before into another building. The Jewish Defense League and their thugs were at the wrong location, and then they let them come down to the right location and stand there and harass and intimidate us. So I wasn't expecting much from U of T because they've been so terrible on Palestine. But I think when they saw what was going on, they realized this was a really serious threat to them as an institution and also a threat to their students. And so they towed a very neutral academic freedom line. They said students have academic freedom, but I could actually tell that they were getting pretty annoyed. Like the provost at one point was like, this is student work, like, this is unacceptable. And I think that she was worried that this was going to intimidate students. And so it'll be really interesting because Israeli Apartheid Week in Toronto is happening in a couple of weeks. And right now we're doing that delicate negotiation about room bookings and security fees, this little dance that we do every year. And I'll be really interested to see what happens because they've been forced into a corner. And you were sort of talking about the attack on Shukri at York University. And Mamdouh Shukri is a man who went to Israel when Dalton McGuinty, our premier, went to Israel, and he's been very I mean, he's terribly anti-union. He's a very right-wing guy. He's been very supportive of Israel, and then even he was attacked. Right? It was a very sort of strange turn of events. So I think more and more, I think these universities that are normally like very pro-Israel, have very deep ties, are going to be forced into this awkward position that the CPCCA forced them into when they tried to get them to say, can you imagine a university administrator getting up and be like, yes, my campus is a hotbed of anti-Semitism, and admitting that, right? But there's I don't think they're being very strategic around the university. So U of T was supporting my academic freedom, and that's more than I expected from them. So hopefully, again, they're going to sort of see what they're up against.
Hello, I'm from Chile, Palestinian, work in Chilean organizations. So during the last, we have a big colony in Chile, more than 300,000 Palestinians, and we're working in different fields and areas. During the last years, we understand that the main problem is politics for us. The lobbies of Israeli lobbies so powerful everywhere. But during 2010, we get some issues that were important for us. First of all, we blocked the free trade agreements between Israel and all the Latin American countries, the South American countries, mainly Brazil. It's such an important market for Israel, and it was blocked. Shimon Peres couldn't visit Brazil. He couldn't meet Lula because Lula disappointed him, not welcome here. And finally, during the last month, all the South American countries recognized Palestine as an independent state with the borders of 1967. Yeah? So that's the work of the Palestinian organizations there. I know that here that the Israeli lobby is much more powerful than there, so to play against them is much harder. But I see you have the same kind of organizations, mostly students and professionals. And how far are we from the lobby to get the support of this kind of countries that probably their weight in the worldwide is much bigger than ours? How far are you from them, or what do we need to do?
Yeah, wow, if we ever reach where you guys are politically. I mean, there's so much more going on, right? Like, you know, Venezuela kicking out the ambassador during the war on Gaza. I mean, I think it's also not insignificant that our countries are moving further and further to the right. The austerity measures that are coming down, the absolute, like, you know, decimation of whatever little bits of the welfare state were left over, and then you have the opposite. You have, like, you know, I mean, I don't want to pretend that it's perfect, but there's a significant shift to the left, and a lot of really exciting things going on politically, and I don't think those things can be separated out. I think we're light years behind. I think North America is going to be the hardest battleground. Europe is bad, but not as bad for fighting this sort of thing. And I think in part it's ideological. Like I said about those very similar histories of colonization and imperialism, and a lot of it is about economics. And so you have very right-wing governments in Israel, very right-wing governments in Canada and the United States, and sort of very like similar ideologies and stuff like that. So, but I think again we have to sort of take inspiration from those tremendous victories and see what's going on in other parts of the world and draw on that. But I think so much of it is just the political situation is so completely different.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that the attacks that are happening against Palestinians are very real, but I think at the same time, the coalition to combat, the Canadian coalition to combat anti-Semitism that Brian Campbell was talking about, I think that it's a lot of fluff and not a lot of substance. Once we get to write about his part, I can tell that I think it's a problem that they can actually succeed in criminalizing the dissent of Israel. And I think we've won some events, especially with certainly the Sunni Free Speech Committee has done this in the past, where they seem to make a much bigger deal of the Canadian Parliament proposing to combat anti-Semitism, and I think it's warranted, and I think we have to be careful about that because it doesn't want to make it to be a much bigger deal than it is, and these other attacks are happening against Palestine activists, and all happening in spite of it, not because of anything that the Canadian Parliament proposed to combat anti-Semitism has done. And if anything comes of it, certainly it should be dealt with then, but I don't think it's something that needs to be an ongoing concern. It risks being distracting from other work that needs to be doing that would be the GDS one.
Well, I think you're right. The Canadian CPCCA is right now defunct. But what it did express for a period of time, and may express again in the future, is a direction of the Zionist leadership in Canada and their parliamentary lobbyists. So I'm not claiming that the CPCCA was the motivating force for the attacks on campuses, but nevertheless it was a prime issue for those organizations. And they were seeking to, in fact, formalize what was happening on the ground. And certainly, Seriously Free Speech, along with other organizations, we've been involved in Jenny's issue, we've been involved in the UBC AMS issue, and have not done anything on CPCCA since it went moribund in November.
Also, another thing to keep in mind is that when students see that CPCCA doing its work, they don't have in mind whether it's effective or not. What they have in mind is that they're being intimidated by politicians. So that makes them less encouraged to do pro-Palestine work, and it actually works. So when you see a couple of parliamentarians, especially ones who are previous ministers or existing ministers doing all this anti-Palestine work, they feel like, well, what if we do pro-Palestine work? Will we also, criticized and shunned aside, and would probably be hurt in the future, whether in the workplace or if you want to run for office or so on and so forth. So students, when they see the CPCCA doing its work, they don't care about the substance they're producing, they just care that they're being intimidated. That's the whole point of us fighting against the CPCCA. We just don't want to be intimidated.
I was wondering if I could read a short poem. Okay, it's called Holocaust.
Peter, do you want to?
Okay. I wrote this poem called Holocaust in 1992. Holocaust, a play on empty words, acts of genocide, a powerful work of hate, justifying a repeat performance, appearing in the Lebensraum. Just desert, now seen as a crime, an epic of Zionist proportions, based on a Nazi true story, propped by Yankee bucks, with a background of oppression, staged for your jingoistic pleasure, at a cost of many Palestinians and their homes. No intermission, curtain call.
I think we have time for 3 more questions. I think I see about 3 hands, so
Well, I'm from Chile too, and I know what happened in South America. Especially, I had to leave my country during the dictatorship, Pinochet. We know what they do in Israel, and my country too, during the 1973. And what happened in Colombia with the secret police from Israel. And what happened in Honduras, and what happened in Nicaragua, Ecuador, Bolivia, all these countries, and also Cuba. And Chavez, he said the last time they stopped the relation with Israel. And when I work in the BGH, Vancouver General Hospital, I invite to my union to participate and support Palestinian people. They say to me, we're not allowed, we have to be neutral. And how can fighting with the enemy, how can we fight with, again, this Zionists? We have to be united. We have to be united, students, workers, communities, again the enemy, again the big monster, unite with the imperialism. Thank you.
I mean, just to say, like, I think that's a big part of it is education and learning the history, right? So part of the geopolitics of it and part of the proxy war was the Israelis going a lot of places the Americans couldn't visibly go, and training secret police and like the School of the Americans. Like it's the history of Israeli involvement is quite shocking, and it's not particularly well known. And I think I'm glad you raised that because so much of this so much of the history of Palestine and the history of Israeli apartheid and also Israel's role in the world just gets buried, right? And so I think it's really, really important that we educate ourselves about stuff like that. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, just a couple of brief political questions for all the speakers. I was just wondering how you feel about the fact and what your strategies are around the fact that the three main political parties in this country all seem to be very pro-Zionist. They're supporting the parliamentary committee. How do you react to that when you see all the actions of these leaders in their support? My second question is, in response to your concern about the very right-wing agenda of the governments of this country, have you considered the fact that the one hope political progressive movement in this country seems to lie in the regional governments, the city governments, regional districts, which have traditionally been supporting an agenda far more progressive? Whether there has been any consideration of going out and trying to work with the local governments to get support for your campaigns and as well as education campaigns, and also in that perspective, when the whole university thing was happening, was there an attempt to gain support from more rural and regional types of colleges and universities to put pressure on the main universities that seem to be so well controlled by the Zionist lobby?
Okay. I mean, yeah, the political parties in this country, I'm just going to say they suck on a variety of levels, and get in the way, I think, a lot, right? Like, I mean, I don't need to get into my sectarian analysis of the NDP, but I think that's what's so good about BDS is that it's creating, it's people power, it's doing the grassroots work. We're not waiting for our government to impose sanctions. We're trying to build a groundswell of public opinion and do that kind of grassroots organizing, because we know it's not going to come from our political parties, Quebec Solidaire being sort of the exception. In terms of city governments, I don't know if you've seen our new mayor. It's a bit awkward to talk about. So there's really not much hope there for anything. Although the fight against Rob Ford is mobilizing people in a way we haven't seen since Mike Harris. So that's really kind of inspiring on a different level. But yeah, I mean, I think we're quite a ways away from working within governments. In terms of smaller universities, I mean, like SPHR has networks, and you can talk a bit more about that, and like all the different universities to put pressure. And partly Israeli apartheid because spreading to the different universities. But the political landscape, I mean, I can only talk about Ontario, which I know the rural governments are just as bad, if not worse, than the provincial ones. And Toronto's just taken like a frightening turn to the, not just the right, but the like bizarre and idiotic. So we're not holding out much hope on that level. But maybe you guys can talk about the situation here a bit more.
Well, in terms of universities, when it comes to UBC at least, all they care about is the students at the university. UBC works like a corporation and we're their customers. So they care about customer reviews essentially. So when we had the whole issue with the $700, we launched a petition and we asked for students to sign it and put in their student numbers. So we raised in a couple of hours, in 3 hours approximately, over 300 signatures. And before the council meeting, we had 500 signatures, whereas the Israeli club had been campaigning online for 2 weeks before us, and he couldn't get more than 200 signatures. So at a university, at UBC at least, when it comes to students, they seem to be generally aware of the situation, and they generally tend to support us. And when it comes to support from outside universities, the only thing they can give us is advice. So for example, when the whole thing happened, I sent out an email to the other branches, especially in Concordia, and I asked them, how did you deal with these kind of issues? And they told me. They give us a lot of advice and a lot of solutions, and we just kind of picked whatever fits the UBC solution. When it comes to small universities like Kwantlen or Langara or the other ones, they don't really have a pro-Palestine presence there, so we can't really do any work. In fact, when I was at Kwantlen, I had a little experience with a Zionist professor here, and I couldn't get any support from there. Luckily, the dean of the arts department he wasn't pro-Palestinian, but he was a reasonable person, and he was able to look at, analyze things rationally, and he supported me in the end. But in small universities, it really is kind of hard because, you know, students don't go there for, they go there temporarily kind of thing, and then they switch to the bigger universities for whatever reasons. So it really is really hard to do activism there. But essentially, I don't know if I answered your question now.
I think the reality is we're still at a level where we're trying to educate the public generally. And until there is a much broader level of consciousness of what's going on in Israel-Palestine, none of the political apparatuses are going to move. And there are none that I can think of in Canada right now that are even close. I mean, we the Seriously Free Speech Committee and other organizations, IJV, have met with various MPs around the CPCCA. And at best, they were sitting on the fence. At worst, they had fallen off on the other side of the fence. So there wasn't much hope in those situations.
Okay, so we're almost out of time, but I think I saw there were 2 hands, so maybe I'll ask if, did you have a question as well? Yeah, so maybe I'll ask if you guys both ask your questions, and then if you guys want to give your answers and sum up. Any last comments?
I would like you to look again at the definition of what is right and what is left, because none of the groups have a monopoly on truth or democracy. I classify them as either being gangsters or freedom lovers. And another thing I would like you to try to think about it, or possibly do some research. I read from some researcher in Poland that there was nothing in the WikiLeaks which would criticize Israel or be pro-Palestinian. And that's sort of ominous. What it has, what it doesn't have.
I just wanted to make a comment. I'm from the Wet'suwet'en Nation, and my husband is Palestinian, so I've taken a great interest in a great deal of the issues. And I think it's really important. I don't know how much work is being done in Canada with the universities, but I was thinking that because there's such a parallel between Canadian Native people and what's happening with the Palestinian people, if you're able to have some of the leaders endorse, I know that in itself can be problematic, because 4 years ago I wrote a letter to the Assembly of First Nations because the chief went to Israel, and I questioned that. I said, how can you talk on behalf of all Native people? So we have to question our own leaders in terms of their decisions. And again, because there's such a parallel with Palestinian people, I wonder if when you have events, if you can invite some of the Native leaders from that. Like for instance, you have an event coming up in Toronto, maybe extend an invitation from somebody from the Six Nations or from the Algonquin people, because our leaders need to become more, they need to engage in more of a dialogue and promote the pro-Palestinian movement. And that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't read all the WikiLeaks stuff. I mean, I know there was some stuff that came out, for Norgate stuff. There was some revelations coming out of cables from Jerusalem and things like that. I think the more significant leak right now would be the Palestine papers and Al Jazeera, but I'm not an expert on that. Yeah, I mean, when Phil Fontaine went to Israel and was working very closely, Israel's actually very actively courting relationships with First Nations in Canada. This is actually something I looked into in my thesis as well, because what they're trying to do is say, yes, we've all experienced genocide, and trying to, in this weird way, claim indigeneity in Israel through this sort of exploitation of First Nations groups. A lot of the work is on water. Manitoba, I think, is their main focus, and doing joint research. And my theory on this was a lot of trying to align those histories, which completely erases the fact that, like Like as a Jewish person living here, I'm a settler on this territory, and I don't share that history. I'm benefiting from that history, but it's a very deliberate process ideologically and also around certain research and stuff. And I mean, they basically destroyed David Henneke, right? Like, and that's why. And I talked to Phil Fontaine about it too. He came and spoke at an event in Toronto, and he was like, "Look, we had no choice, right? We had to after what happened." And also he was like, we can't choose our friends. We don't have very many, so we have to take them where we get them. But again, doing solidarity with an Indigenous movement halfway around the world as settlers on this territory, we have a tremendous responsibility to talk about Canadian apartheid and what goes on here. And so in Kaya, we've worked really closely with Six Nations. When there was the blockade, it was this like beautiful moment where they raised the Palestinian flag over the blockade. We also have a relationship with Tyendinaga, which is an hour and a half away. I don't think we do enough of that work together, and I think we really need to continue to make those links because there's so much of a connection there. And again, with Israeli Apartheid Week coming up in most of the major centers, as part of the basis of unity, we say to people, you have to talk about Indigenous issues. On this territory, and having a really strong commitment to doing that. But again, it's always a struggle, and it's something that we need to keep at the forefront. But it's really interesting. If you look into the research of the way Israel is courting First Nations in Canada, it's fascinating the amount of links they're trying to make, and people need to do sort of more work on what's going on there.
Can I just make another quick comment further to that? I think that an effective approach might be to promote some of the pro-Palestinian projects in like the Wind Speaker and some of the native newspapers. I think it would be really hard to get black press to try and promote any of the activities, but I just think that maybe brainstorming on how we can get the word out to more of our people. I personally am doing that work with my family and extended family members, but it would be nice to see a really close relationship and the native people promoting. That's what I would like to see.
There's a really interesting project that went down in the States called the Seventh Generation Indigenous Visionaries, and they took a group of, I think most of them from the territory near Kansas, to Palestine, and made links between Indigenous folks down in the States and in Palestine, and they've written a lot of amazing stuff, and it's a really cool project that's being done down there, and that's definitely a goal, is to create delegations and to create those links and stuff. That's really great.
Just before we close up, I'd like to mention that there's some literature on the table out there from Seriously Free Speech. You might want to pick up and read.
We actually just have one last comment, I believe.
We just have to remember the structure that Canada has placed upon the First Nations people. The chiefs that she's speaking about are the elected chiefs, which I call puppet people for the government. This is how a lot of our people have lost a lot of our lands, is electing these chiefs in positions of saying that they need these in place in order for them to put money through the reserves. But if you look at the reserves and the conditions of our people, it's very devastating. In a land as rich that is supposed to be, this Canadian, this occupied land, I call it, our people here in Canada are dealing with policies of genocide. Thus, the residential school, which hasn't disappeared, it's been replaced by the welfare system. So I do speak out about our Indigenous people worldwide and talk about the similarities and how genocide, policies of genocide have been in place in Canada for years. The end result, 500 to 3,000 women died and gone missing. I'm part of the Memorial March in the downtown Eastside, which happens on Monday, and I welcome you all to be a part of that. Men, dying in custody, our youth committing suicide, or kids taken away. So it continues. So there is a lot of educating happening within the Native communities, and just remembering the structure that this Canadian system has put upon our people to keep us oppressed, to keep us below poverty. So they do have the elected chiefs in position. And as for Phil Fontaine, I would like to personally tell him where to go. Especially with the residential school and the settlement and how they're treating our elders and our survivors. Canada has a lot to be ashamed of. Mm-hmm. And My people all over the world have my support.
Honorable